Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club program. I'm Lenny Mendonca, former Chief Economic and Business Advisor for the state of California, a member of the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth Club, and your moderator for today. It's my pleasure to introduce or reintroduce Steve Case. Steve, as you all know, is an internet pioneer, successful entrepreneur, philanthropist, and author of the new book, The Rise of the Rest: How Entrepreneurs in Surprising Places Are Building the New American Dream. In 1985, Steve co-founded America Online, which later became the first internet company to go public in 1992. Steve is chairman and CEO of Revolution, a Washington, D.C. based investment firm, and has partnered with on such business ventures as Zipcar, Sweetgreen, and DraftKings. 8 years ago, he also launched Revolution's Rise of the Rest, an initiative to accelerate the growth of tech startups across the country. Additionally, Steve was the founding co-chair of the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship and a member of President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. A reminder to our audience that we encourage you to submit your questions for Steve in the text chat on YouTube. I will start the conversation and then get to your questions as the conversation goes. So Steve, welcome back virtually to the Commonwealth Club. It's great to see you again.
Great to be back, and always great to be with you, Lenny. We've been on this journey together for the last decade, trying to support entrepreneurs everywhere.
That seems like yesterday, but it's good to see you again. So Steve, let me start with the focus of the conversation on your book, The Rise of the Rest. So why don't you give the audience a little bit of context about where this came from and why you wrote this book now?
Well, I wrote this book now because I've spent most of the decade traveling around the country, seeing what entrepreneurs are building, seeing how cities are being reimagined, revitalized, renewed because of the work of entrepreneurs, startups, and the job creation, economic growth, and vitality they drive. And after seeing this now dozens and dozens of times, we've visited dozens of cities with our bus tours. We've now made 200 investments in 100 different cities. It was a remarkable story around what's happening all across America that isn't really being told. Most people have no idea that some of these cities are really showing momentum as startup cities. So that's why I wrote the book. In terms of the backstory, some of this you covered in your introduction. I kind of stumbled into this, I guess, a little over a decade ago when I was asked to co-chair that National Advisory Council on Innovation Entrepreneurship. That led to a series of recommendations and that sometimes the White House embraced, and President Obama launched an initiative I chaired called Startup America Partnership, and then as you mentioned, worked on his Jobs Council, including on the Jobs Act. So for a while, it's very policy focused. What policies could be put in place that maximize the likelihood of America kind of leading the charge and continuing to be the most innovative nation in the world. But then, as you said, about 8 years ago, decided to supplement that by hitting the road with a bus, kind of an Americana road trip to different cities. Our first one actually 8 years ago was in Detroit. Interestingly, I was in Detroit yesterday for a series of events, and it's a perfect example of what's possible here. Detroit 100 years ago was the most innovative city in the country when Silicon Valley, your backyard, was still just agriculture, growing fruit, not growing startups. Then Detroit fell onto hard times, lost 60% of its population. The year before we rolled in on our bus, city of Detroit went bankrupt. And now, just 9 years later, it's booming in terms of the downtown area because of startups and the work that's happened there. So we then kept going, did 43 of these city visits, and it's just been remarkable, as I said, to see what's happening in different parts of the country. And not surprisingly, I think you and others have been watching this. Some people listening may be part of this. The pandemic led to a little bit of a rethink for a lot of people, and some people decided to live someplace else, work remotely, and that's actually fueling an acceleration of some of the trends around Rise of the Rest. So I think the book comes out at a great time. I think when society's rethinking things, a little bit of a shake the snow globe moment around work and life and so forth, and I think it bodes well for what can happen in cities all across the country. Last point I'll make before ask another question is I should point out, knowing this is the Commonwealth Club, that when we talk about the rise of the rest, we're not predicting the decline of Silicon Valley or any other place. Silicon Valley, as everybody knows, is resilient and robust, and for sure will continue to be the leader of the pack, the kind of the pride of America, the envy of the world. That's not going to change. But what is going to change, and what I think needs to change, is creating a more inclusive innovation economy. So more cities have the benefit of creating jobs of the future, being part of the industries of the future. Those communities, as a result, are stronger, and people feel more optimistic about the future. Too many people in this country, feel left out and left behind. And what we're trying to do with Rise Rest, hopefully can address that, at least in part.
That's great. So book and your tours really were pre-pandemic in terms of the visiting across the country and seeing and investing. Your prior book, Third Wave, talked about the next generation of the internet. Is that an enabler of what's going on, or what is making this possible now that gets you excited?
Yeah, I think it was definitely an enabler, and we're seeing momentum build over the last decade. But as I said, I think the pandemic was, in the last couple of years, kind of that tipping point that will, I think, prove to be an accelerant. But going back a little bit, for those who were not familiar with the other book I wrote 6 years ago, I basically shared my perspective, having been one of the kind of early entrepreneurs in the internet. For those who don't recall us, but in 1985, when we started, only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were online an average of 1 hour a week. So it's pretty early days. And when we said we wanted to get America online, we were serious about it. The other interesting point was, back then in 1985, the internet was still restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. So consumers and businesses actually weren't legally allowed to be on the internet. It required changing legislation a few years later to allow that to happen. So it's kind of early days in that first wave of kind of building the on-ramps to get people on the internet, creating reasons why people should get on the internet, getting computer companies to build communications technology modems into products, getting communications costs down so it could be much more affordable. There are a bunch of things that had to happen in that first decade. And then what followed is this sort of the second wave was building app software on top of the internet. That's obviously where Silicon Valley and Google, Facebook, so many companies really rose to prominence, arguably even dominance in that second wave. This third wave is where the internet meets the real world and disrupts some pretty big industries like healthcare, food and ag, things like that. And while a lot of that innovation obviously will continue to come from Silicon Valley, we think it will be dispersed around the country, in part because in those third wave, partnerships will become much more important. And in healthcare, for example, some of the most important hospitals to partner with are in different parts of the country. You may be advantaged to be in those cities, and we backed a number of companies that really build on the unique legacy of and history of those particular cities. Like in Chattanooga, we backed a company called FreightWaves that built a Bloomberg data platform for the trucking and logistics industry. And I didn't know this till we were on our bus in Chattanooga, but some of the biggest trucking companies in America are headquartered in Chattanooga. So if you're building Bloomberg for trucking, actually better to be in Chattanooga than San Francisco or New York or some other places. And we're seeing more and more of those examples. So as this third wave accelerates, as sort of the internet meets the real world, as partnerships become more important, that creates an opportunity for entrepreneurs in different parts of the country to start companies that maybe weren't possible before. The fact that there's more capital now flowing, there's 1,400 new regional venture firms have started up in the last decade. That's sort of a game changer in terms of the capital, kind of piece. So I think it bodes well for this dispersion of talent, this dispersion of capital, this dispersion of job creation. As I said, Silicon Valley will still be the leader, but I think it will be less dominant in the next 10 or 20 years than it has been in the last 10 and 20 years. I think that's actually good for the nation. How do you create an economy that works for more people in more places?
Tell us a little bit about your bus tours and what those were like, what you learned. It wasn't like you were sitting in your office in Washington and having people come to you with business ideas. You were out traveling the country. What was that like?
No, we just decided, partly, as I said, to supplement some of the policy work. I hit the road and just see what's happening firsthand. And I remember the first tour 8 years ago, I mentioned Detroit. We also went to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Nashville. To be honest, we didn't really know what we were getting into. We thought it might just be a one-off and, we'd see what's happening in these cities and try to encourage more collaboration, more tolerance, support of entrepreneurs. Maybe encourage a little more capital to flow. Did pitch competitions every city and made an investment in one of the companies. But after the first tour, we said, there's something about this is interesting. It feels like maybe we can have some impact here. So we did a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one, and a fifth one, and a sixth one, and a seventh one, and an eighth one, and suddenly we've been in 43 cities around the country, and really we're struck by what was happening in these different cities. Each is a little bit different, but the dynamics were had some patterns to it that were encouraging, and ultimately that led to starting an investment fund focused specifically on these rise of the rest cities, and rather than go to institutional investors, we actually raised all the capital from individuals, but prominent individuals who had success as innovators, whether it be entrepreneurs or investors, folks like in your neck of woods, people like Eric Schmidt and Reid Hoffman, and venture investors like John Doerr and Jim Breyer, and private equity folks on the East Coast like Henry Kravis, David Rubenstein, hedge fund people like Ray Dalio, entrepreneurs like Tory Burch and Sarah Blakely. Dozens of people joined us on this because they too believed in this idea of the rise of the rest. They too believed in the idea of backing entrepreneurs, everywhere, and they believed it would be a good investment strategy because most folks were focused on just investing in a few places, and also have a way to have a constructive, positive impact in many of these communities. And just for those who don't follow this, the data, I know this, Lenny, but maybe not everybody does. Over the last decade, 75% of venture capital has gone to 3 states. 75%. Of course, California is one, New York and Massachusetts are the other 2, which advantages those states, and that's probably why a lot of people listening are there. But it creates challenges for other states, and some of the disruptions in places like Silicon Valley end up negatively impacting jobs in other communities, and that leads to frustration and even resentment. So people need to be part of the future, not be left behind. And I think the only way to do that is to back more entrepreneurs in more places, creating more interesting companies, and recognize that the puck has moved a little bit in terms of what's possible in this next era.
So I had the pleasure a couple of years ago of on this the Commonwealth Club interviewing Jim and Deb Fallows on their
Our Towns
and their plane tours, and they had a similar sense of renewal happening across the country that wasn't being talked about, and they had a set of indicators for places that they felt were on that rise. Do you have a
like beer pubs?
That was my favorite.
That was
one.
one of them. We've compared notes, actually, just to exchange messages with them in the last few days, and we're going to do some things related to the Rise of the Rest book soon. No, they what they did was, it was not specifically focused on entrepreneurship. It was focused more broadly on what are the dynamics that are developing in communities. David Brooks has also done some work on this. What are the dynamics that are developing in the communities that are resulting in healthier communities? And how can we learn from that, and how can we showcase that? And maybe that's, some of those lessons can be applied in other places. So it's a little bit of a broader societal brush that they've both taken. We've been more narrowly focused on the role entrepreneurs play in terms of new developing communities. And again, this was news to me, and when I got involved in this policy work a decade ago, Lenny, because your work with McKinsey and others, you knew it long before I did it, but I did not realize, I should have, but I did not realize until a decade ago that most new jobs, net new jobs, are created by new companies under 5 years, not small business, not big business, but new business. Didn't know that. Of course, small business is important. Of course, big business is important, but the net job creation was mostly from new business. So from startups, not just tech startups, but many kinds of startups. Did not know that, and also didn't know these statistics around where venture capital is invested. And not every company wants or needs to raise venture capital. I want to bootstrap or figure out other ways to finance the companies. But the data also is pretty compelling. And the companies that are most successful in terms of creating significant companies, significant values, significant jobs, are venture backed. So if we're overwhelmingly backing entrepreneurs in a few places and leaving out a lot of entrepreneurs in other places, that creates this disconnect. So that's really what led us to hit the road. And there's a whole chapter in the book around kind of what makes a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem, and there are 7 different factors that need to each have some attention. Some have more of that than others. Again, it's not a one size fits all approach, but trying to figure out how to get all these ingredients, kind of elements working together in a collaborative kind of increasing return network effect kind of dynamic is critically important. 3, I'll just focus in particular on one we've talked about, which is the capital piece. That some people have family wealth and can fund something themselves. Most people don't. Some people have friends and family that have wealth that they can tap into. Most people don't. So figuring out ways to fund those entrepreneurs with those ideas is important. And that's why things like what I mentioned earlier, the 1,400 new regional venture firms is important. So there's a capital piece. There's a talent piece. And in many parts of the country, people have left where they grew up, left where they went to school because they didn't think there was opportunity there, and they felt there was better opportunity elsewhere, usually on the coast, including many folks, obviously, listening to this Commonwealth Club talk in the Bay Area, and that's fine if people choose to be there, obviously. But it's not as fine if people feel that's the only place they can be if they want to be part of the innovation economy. And so there's been a little bit of a hollowing out of some of the talent in different parts of the country, kind of a brain drain over the last several decades. So how do we slow the brain drain and even create a boomerang? And as we talked before, the pandemic has been helpful on the boomerang side of it. So winning the battle for talent, winning the battle for people, not just trying to lure companies to your city, but lure people to your city is where a lot of the attention has started to shift, which I think is healthy. And the final one is creating a vibrant community supportive of entrepreneurs. And this is what, as everybody listening knows, is so great about Silicon Valley. The art of the possible. If a startup that fails is that person's not a failure. It didn't work, and they'll learn something and get up and keep fighting, and eventually will be successful. And when people hear pitches in Silicon Valley, they typically tend to focus more on what might go right as opposed to what might go wrong. Of course, you need to understand the risk factors, but you need to suspend a little disbelief and think about the art of the possible. And that is great about Silicon Valley. And that is an area that has been more of a challenge in these rise cities. And we're trying to address that through some of the work we're doing. Even book hopefully will help on that front. But creating communities that are more supportive of entrepreneurs, are more supportive of risk taking. So those are some of the factors that are worth focusing on. But there are others that were outlined in the book.
That's great. One of the things that was common in the stories that Jim and Deb were telling and the stories that I read in your book is in many of these communities, there was a great history and legacy of important industries and entrepreneurs, but more of a sense of, well, that was the past. It passed us by. And what can we do now? How much of this is about community mindset and just a sense that there's possibility to really encourage it?
Huge. So that's one of the key factors that and one of the things that's been really gratifying to see is when companies succeed in a city. A significant company scales up, and we think of it as like a tentpole company. A bunch of things happen. One is that people in the community say, "Wow, maybe we can do it. Maybe we can be in the Olympics. Maybe we're not just like the kind of building little companies. We have the potential to build big companies. That's important in terms of the psychology of a community." Another thing that happens is some of the people that were in that company early and had stock options, other things, suddenly have some wealth, and they tend to reinvest that, at least in part, in the next generation of entrepreneurs, an angel investor or starting a venture fund or what have you. And the third thing that happens is some of those people, particularly if the company gets really big, end up deciding they want to do something else, and they spin out of the company, and often are entrepreneurs starting their own company, or again, investors backing companies. Again, this is well understood in Silicon Valley. It's part of the reason why Silicon Valley has been so successful. It's only now starting to happen in different cities. One example in the book is Indianapolis, which most people don't necessarily think is a great startup city. Actually is showing remarkable momentum, and particularly around enterprise software. And there's a bunch of factors for it. Got a great university there, some big anchor, Fortune 500 companies there. But a lot of it has to do with the success in the last decade of a tentpole company called ExactTarget that was acquired by Salesforce in San Francisco 5-6 years ago for $2.5 billion. At the time, people in Indianapolis were worried that Salesforce would shift all its people to San Francisco. Salesforce did the opposite. They've actually doubled their workforce in Indianapolis. Salesforce has 2,000 employees in Indianapolis now, second only to their, the San Francisco. And by the way, people in San Francisco know the Salesforce Tower because it's sort of iconic. Salesforce also has a tower in Indianapolis, which also is the tallest building in Indianapolis. So suddenly Salesforce has a huge presence in Indianapolis. But more importantly, some of the people, including the founder, went on to launch an accelerator and a venture fund. And now there's dozens of enterprise software companies that are flourishing in the greater Indianapolis area. So there's a bunch of things that happen, kind of success begets success, momentum begets momentum. I saw this even here in the Washington, D.C. area. We started AOL in Northern Virginia, in the Tyson's Corner area. And at the time, it was not supportive of startup. There was no venture capital in this area. All the money we raised came from New York, Toronto, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco. None of it from our own neighborhood. And it was a struggle in the first decade to hire people, and it was hard. But eventually we broke through. Eventually we're successful. Now, 35 years later, when Amazon does a second headquarters search, where do they end up? Northern Virginia, not too far from where we started AOL. That would have been inconceivable 3 decades ago. So it just shows what's possible if you're focused on launching these companies, backing these entrepreneurs, and really shifting your economy from, as you say, just kind of legacy industries, kind of historical Fortune 500 companies to be launching new companies. And the data point that surprised me also that sort of, and it gets people's attention when we travel around the country, is the data around Fortune 500 companies, which is that every 25 years, half of the Fortune 500 turns over, half. So if you're not birthing new companies, you're not seeding new companies, some of your big companies are going to fall by the wayside. You have to offset that by launching some new companies, some of which will fail like startup, but some of which could be your Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow.
Even prior to the pandemic, it felt like there was a renewed interest in many local and state governments, and to some degree at the federal government, in trying to encourage this kind of, call it place-based industrial policy, startup renewal. And since the pandemic, it's accelerated. In California, we have what started as being called Regions Rise Together, created a community economic resilience funding, the national level, the EDA, giving out very large grants for renewal. So how much of what you're seeing going on is government engaged in this, and are they helpful partners, or do they understand it? What are you seeing from the public sector?
No, I think they're helpful partners. Ultimately, I do think it comes down to the entrepreneurs are willing to start a company and fight the battle, and investors willing to back them. But I think public policy does matter, and some of the work we did together, even with the UVA and the kind of can startups save the American dream? And there was 7 or 8 years ago the work with the President Obama's Jobs Council 10 years ago. Kind of it led to some things like the Jobs Act that were helpful. As you say, there has been a pivot in not every city and state, but most cities and states, where governors and mayors who historically focused economic development on just getting a big company to move their headquarters, or a big company to open a factory or something like that, to recognizing the real sustainable future and the more economically efficient strategy is to birth new companies, not just lure big companies, and now increasingly also lure people as opposed to luring companies. So that's been super helpful, and that's, I think, good for those communities, because it tends to be much more efficient than some big, kind of writing a big check to get somebody to move. It takes more time. It's much more of a grassroots kind of thing, where it takes more time. You have to be patient, but ultimately bears more fruit. And it's also better for the country, because this battle between states is really a zero-sum game. But we don't add anything to the country. It just one state wins, one state loses, one state probably overpays to win, and it's way better for each of those states or cities, and way better for the country to instead focus on launching new companies. Don't just try to get Amazon to open their second headquarters figure out a way to get the next Jeff Bezos to start the company in your city and really create that company in your own backyard. I think that the recognition about that is more significant. And as you have more of these successful tentpole companies, Duo Security in Ann Arbor, MailChimp just got acquired last year in Atlanta for $12 billion. The companies like Epic, which is the leading health tech company because they kind of control electronic medical records. A lot of hospitals, are outside of Madison, Wisconsin. When you see that, these successes, in different parts of the country, it leads people in those communities to believe more, and also leads investors on the coast to start to pay more attention to what's happening in other cities. But the policy does help. And even on the federal side, some of the recent policies, as have been super helpful. You mentioned the EDA grants, which also is part of the legislation, the CHIPS and Science Act that passed this summer. There's, $10 billion of funding, authorized for regional hubs. There's also some funding in the Inflation Reduction Act around, climate tech that I think could be super helpful. Federal government obviously needs to do more around immigration reform so we can continue to win what's a global battle for talent. So there is a role for government, but ultimately kind of set the table, set the rules, create the right fertile environment at the national, state, and city level. But then it's really up to, as I said earlier, the entrepreneurs and the investors to kind of take it and run with it.
So for those of you joining, reminder that we're here speaking with Steve Case about his new book, Rise of the Rest, How Entrepreneurs in Surprising Places Are Building the New American Dream. We will be getting to your questions in just a few minutes. I see a number of them coming in, but let me ask Steve just a couple more, and then we'll go to the audience questions. One of the things you talked about in the book, and certainly I've seen on the ground a number of places where I've been working, is the role that our higher education system plays in, whether it's in research universities, but also our community colleges and workforce development part of our higher education system. How much is that as a part of the story in the cities that you were visiting?
No, it's a huge part. And in terms of the kind of training people for the jobs of the future is critically important. And goes back to the earlier comment I made around the brain drain. Some of it, of course, in the Bay Area, you got Stanford and Berkeley and Caltech and a lot of great universities. There are also a lot of great universities all around the country, Purdue and, Michigan and Ann Arbor and Carnegie Mellon and Pittsburgh. And I can list, dozens of others that are some of the very best research universities, and sometimes the best in terms of certain technologies, ag tech or other kinds of things. But what historically has happened is when people have graduated, they've left because there's not much going on there. And so that goes back to the point I made around the brain drain. These great universities exist everywhere. I'm sure many people listening to this who maybe are living in the Bay Area now did go to one of these universities somewhere else in the country, and they decided, probably correctly, to leave the Bay Area because there was more stuff happening there, more money there, more people, more action, more vitality and so forth. It made perfect sense. But how do you get more of create the startup communities in these cities, in Ann Arbor, in Pittsburgh, in some of these other cities, so people are likelier to stay, and even some people are likelier to return. And that has changed quite meaningfully in the last decade, both in terms of the startup communities in these cities and also some of the big companies in Silicon Valley, Facebook, Google, et cetera, recognizing they couldn't scale if they just relied on kind of a one headquarters strategy. They needed to disperse their workforce, and most of these big tech companies have built pretty significant operations, hundreds of people, in some cases more than 1,000 people in these great university towns like or cities like Pittsburgh and many others. So that aspect of it is important. And the other aspect that's important that we try to encourage when we're traveling around, and I cite a number of examples in the book, is how do you get the universities, which always have been a magnet for talent and always been a birthplace for new ideas, new things in labs and so forth. How do you get more of those ideas in the hands of entrepreneurs that can turn them into startups and turn them into companies? And some places are doing better than others, but that's another big opportunity where we can think about ideas and the dispersion of ideas and the development of ideas in a more diffused way. And give people more flexibility to decide where they want to live, where they want to work, how they want to live, how they want to work than has been historically the case. And we've seen this it's not that surprising that we're seeing this now in the technology sector, because we've seen this in the last century in the entertainment sector and in the financial service sector. There was a time where if you wanted to be in the entertainment business, kind of had to be on Hollywood. That's where the action was. Some people still choose to be in, the Los Angeles area, but I think most people now recognize you can be in the movie business, the music business, you name it, kind of anywhere in the country, indeed anywhere in the world. And similarly, there was a time you wanted to be in financial services, you had to be on Wall Street, you had to be in New York. That was the place to be. And now there's tons of really successful firms of all types in the financial services industry in other places, and tons of people working for some of the big firms in New York that are, have chosen to live in different places. So this is just a natural, kind of dispersion that happens as industries progress. I think we're just on we're seeing more of that now in the tech sector. And as we talked about earlier, the pandemic clearly has been an accelerator.
Can I ask you a little bit more about that as you're now launching the book and having these conversations post-pandemic, or through at least the most severe parts of the pandemic? How has the pandemic affected your sense of the opportunities or the context for entrepreneurship in around the country?
Well, it was building pre-pandemic. Some of the dynamics around these rising cities we've seen develop pretty much, every tour we've done every year. It's like we're making a little bit of progress. But I think the pandemic we'll look back and call it 10 years and say that really was kind of that tipping point. And it goes back to some of the topics we talked about. But first, the first thing that happened was some people, including some people in the Bay Area, deciding to move someplace else. And some might have thought it was just for a week or a month. And for some, they intended it for it to be a week or a month. For some, it ended up being a year or two. And for some, it ended up being, come to think of it, I kind of like this place, I'm going to stay. And initially, what those people have done is continue to work for the company they were working for before, but do it remotely. As as some of those companies shift their policies and say, maybe we want you back in the office, that leads some people to say, well, maybe I should leave. And also, as they're in these communities and see what's happening, including in the startup sector in these communities, that most of them were unaware of what was happening in various cities around the country, they say, well, maybe I actually want to stay in the city, but leave that company and do something else because I'm seeing opportunity here. So that was the first piece, essentially around people and talent. The second piece was, it took most venture capitalists 2 or 3 months to get their bearings as everybody was adjusting to this new world. And everybody was obviously concerned about cash and triage of their portfolio, which companies were going to survive, which company needed more capital, and so forth. And after a few months of that, they said, well, I guess if we're going to make new investments, we're not going to have meetings with people because we can't meet. We're going to use Zoom for pitch meetings to meet entrepreneurs. And they started doing Zoom pitches. And after a while, they said, I guess come to think of it, if I'm doing a Zoom pitch meeting, it doesn't really matter if the entrepreneur is a mile away or 1,000 miles away, which opened up their opportunity for some of these entrepreneurs, some of these other places. And now once people have made investments in these other places, what typically happens is they made an investment and we start learning about other companies in that place, and that leads to other investments. And over time, you build up some expertise and network in those particular cities. So that also has been a kind of in some ways a game changer. It'll be interesting to see what happens the next 5 or 10 years, but I think it has opened up the eyes of many venture capitalists, including in places like the Bay Area, to the fact that there are really interesting entrepreneurs building really interesting disruptive companies in other places, and they're now trying to figure out what is the right strategy to do that.
Great. We are going to go to audience questions here in just a couple minutes, but I have 2 more for you, Steve, before I do that. I was really pleased to see your chapter 12 talking about the diversity imperative and ensuring that our startup support and entrepreneurs look like the America that we're in today and heading into, as opposed to a lot of what the history looked more like old white guys like you and me. So why is that important? And are you seeing that occurring in different parts of the country?
Yeah, I think it is important. And it's not just from a fairness and equity standpoint, which is obviously important. It's also from having more shots on goal, more people, starting things, some of which will end up being some of the biggest ideas, some of the biggest companies. And if you don't have everybody on the field, or at least everybody having the opportunity to be on the field, if they have an idea to take it and run with it, I think we're less likely as a nation to continue to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. So that there's a broader strategic imperative. And there's also an investment opportunity, that generally money is made by doing something a little contrarian. If everybody's doing the same thing, it's kind of hard to find a market edge. That's true in the public markets. That's also true in the private market. So if most people are investing in certain kinds of people that look a certain way in certain places, supply and demand will suggest those valuations might be on the high side. And if you're looking up for different people in different places, there might be more of an opportunity. So there's a mix of factors. But the data, for those who don't follow this, I talked about the place-based venture capital data, 75% of it the dollar going to 3 states. If you look at people, even though women are 50% of our population, female founders get less than 10% of venture capital. Even though Black Americans are 13% of our population, Black founders get less than 1% of venture capital. So it does matter where you live, and it does matter what you look like if you have an idea whether you have a chance to really scale it. And as I said, there's a lot of reasons why we should address that. The encouraging thing is, as we've traveled around the country, some of the cities we're investing in, Atlanta, Baltimore, et cetera, tend to be more diverse, and the entrepreneurs tend to be reflective of the communities they're living in. And we have been intentional when we come into town to try to make sure we are creating an inclusive environment. And we do things like pitch competitions. We deliberately reach out to a wide range of groups within each city before we visit, trying to make sure we are aware of some of the very best entrepreneurs, irrespective of where they live or what their background is, or et cetera, et cetera. And that's been helpful. And so right now, I think 41% of the companies we back with our Rise the Rest seed fund are either female founders or founders of color, which is still not what it should be, frankly, but it's quite a bit higher than you see in most venture firms, including in the Bay Area.
Okay. So you're on the bus tour, and a college age woman comes up to you and says, I'm thinking about being an entrepreneur, and I live in, pick your city, Salt Lake City, Indianapolis, Nashville. What would you tell her?
Well, first of all, I'd tell her, go for it. I try to just encourage anybody who has an idea and thinks it could be an important, breakthrough and lead to an important company, to not just think about it, but to do it. And I would increasingly encourage that person to think about doing it from wherever they are, in the community they already live in, as opposed to feeling, as many people have, that they don't really have a shot there. They really need to move someplace else, Bay Area, New York, some other place where there is more, venture capital. This number I mentioned before, that 1,400 new venture firms have started in these different Rise the Rest cities, I think is encouraging. There is, investment capital in every city now that wasn't there even 10 years ago. You then also need to supplement that with a team and find people in your community that want to join you on this endeavor. And leverage, goes back to the pandemic question, leverage the fact that remote work is more possible. So suddenly companies, as they're starting and scaling, just as Bay Area companies can tap into the talent pool in other cities, the entrepreneurs in those other cities can also tap into the talent pool in the Bay Area. So some of the people that have been, had great success watching a company or helping a company grow fast in Silicon Valley have the opportunity to apply those skills to some company in some other part of the country. So that unlocks a lot of the opportunity to really build some pretty significant companies from different cities all around the country. I'll give you an example. In Chicago, this company Tempus we backed, just started 6-7 years ago, focused on basically precision medicine. People have a diagnosis around cancer, better understanding what the situation is so they can recommend a more precise therapy. They've gone on to hire over 1,000 people, including a lot of data scientists, tons of data scientists coming out of University of Illinois. Historically, they'd go to the coast. Now more and more are staying in Chicago. This company's gone on to raise $1 billion and has some pretty significant anchor investors, including Google. So this is starting to happen. And the real story of this book, and the reason to write the book, is it's not just 1 or 2 or 3 cities. It's actually dozens of cities that are really on the rise. So I would just encourage that woman to, kind of understand what she's obviously trying to do and why she thinks it could be successful, why that product, that service, whatever the angle might be, could be better than in fact, meaningfully better than the alternatives. And then figure out the right way to launch that company and not presume she has to move to do it. Or presume that she can only hire people locally to do it. Figure out some way to build a team, some way to raise the capital, some way to kind of take a shot.
Great. Okay, now I'm going to move on to a number of audience questions. So we've talked a couple times about the statistic of historically 3/4 of the venture capital going to 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York. If we look forward 5-10 years, long enough to see how these funds have played out, what do you think that's going to look like in that time frame? And where, I know it's hard to say it's going to be this state or that state, but what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to be, there's going to be a 4th state? Is it going to be spread broadly? What do you think is going to happen?
No, I think it's going to be spread more broadly. And how much the 3 big winner states, California, New York, and Massachusetts have, it's hard to predict. Clearly, it's going to come down from the 75%. If it came down from 75% to call it 50%, that actually means the other states have doubled from 25% to 50%. That would be pretty significant in terms of some of those cities. So I think it's a percentage of that overall pool. I think it will distribute. I don't think it'll just be 1 or 2 states. I think people will be surprised. Even I was surprised again, which is why I wrote the book that profiles 30 different cities and what different things that are happening in those cities around usually some of these legacy industries that give them a strategic competitive advantage. So I really do think it's going to be more dispersed. At the same time, it's kind of game on in terms of which cities and which states really capitalize on this and really rise over the next decade. And there's some trends that give me a sense. If I had to write down the list of what I thought the winner's circle might look like 10 years from now, it would be a longer list of winner's circle. I'll have some cities in there that probably won't be in there because they won't execute against this opportunity. Other cities that I wouldn't have necessarily thought would be on that list that are, start, showing some momentum, really capitalizing on this particular opportunity. For example, I was several times in Northwest Arkansas over the years, and it was a little struggle for them to get going. Now they've really built what's beginnings of a pretty robust startup community. We launched, we backed a number of companies there. One called Acre Trader. The founder actually was in San Francisco and decided to move to Arkansas because it's a company that's really an investing platform around farmland. He said, "I'm going to create this vehicle for people to invest in farmland. I'd probably be better off being closer to the farmers. I need to get them to buy into what I'm doing, trust what I'm doing, build confidence in what I'm doing." So he built that company in Fayetteville. It's gone on now to raise, I think it's $80 million and scaling quite significantly. And most people would not have thought, a few years ago that Fayetteville or some of these other cities that I write about in the book really could be thriving startup communities. So it's going to surprise people, I think, overall how many cities rise up, and even surprise me in terms of what that ultimate kind of winner's circle will look like.
Right. I mean, we're obviously talking about the United States, but we're talking about a global economy as well. Are there lessons from other parts of the world around how to encourage a startup environment that we can learn from?
Yeah, I think it's mostly other countries trying to figure out how to learn from us, because America has led the way in terms of innovation, entrepreneurship, led the way with even ideas like venture capital, which is not that, it's like a 50-year-old concept. It hasn't, venture capital as an asset class is still relatively young, so they're trying to figure out ways to leverage or learn from what we've done to create this innovative culture and back some of the breakthrough companies. But I would say there are some countries that have really taken advantage of particular industry expertise and insights they have, and also create a much more dynamic entrepreneurial culture. And one good example is Israel, that over the last couple of decades has really emerged in a pretty significant way, in part because of some of their investments in defense technologies, and in part because of the success of some companies. It goes back to this tentpole company I mentioned, idea I mentioned before. I happened to be with Ehud Barak just a couple of weeks ago at something, and he reminded me that AOL 25 years ago bought a company there called ICQ, a messaging company for nearly $500 million. And it's a relatively new startup with very little revenue. And it shocked people that that was possible to create such a valuable company so quickly. And that actually led to an acceleration of venture investing in startup companies in Israel. And so a combination of factors really kind of led that to be the case. And if you look at the global numbers around venture capital, 25 years ago, over 90% of venture capital was invested in the United States. So globally, we were dominant. Now it's under 50%. So clearly, we're seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship while we're also seeing within the United States the regionalization of entrepreneurship, which to me is just a reminder why we need to focus on backing more entrepreneurs in more places and kind of trying to have a more inclusive innovation economy. Other countries have kind of figured out that the secret sauce that has powered the American story over the last 250 years is this focus on leaning into the future, backing crazy entrepreneurs, and they're trying to figure out ways to do more of that in their countries.
You wouldn't be surprised that, given that we're in the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, that there are a number of questions about your view of the future of Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. I heard you mention that the rise of the rest isn't a statement of a death sentence for Silicon Valley, that it ought to be a positive statement for the rest of the country. But what do you think the future of Silicon Valley looks like, and what should the folks here be thinking about as we enter into this next era?
Well, I think it will continue to be bright, and as I said earlier, I think Silicon Valley will continue to be the leader of the pack by far in terms of kind of innovation, kind of regions, not just in this country but around the world. I don't think that's going to change. It's more this, as we get more dispersion of innovation, dispersion of talent, dispersion of capital, its dominance will be reduced. So I do think I don't mean it in a pejorative way to people in San Francisco, but I do think we kind of hit peak Silicon Valley a few years ago, and things will change, and I think a healthy way for the country over the next 10 or 20 years. It's also interesting to me that because so many people just presume, people I talk to at least presume that Silicon Valley has always been dominant. The 2 points I make are, number one, that 100 years ago, when Detroit was the dominant innovation city, Silicon Valley was just fruit orchards. It wasn't growing startups, it was growing fruit, point one. Point two, in the early days of the internet, when companies like mine were started in the 1980s, it was actually pretty regionally distributed. We were in Northern Virginia. Hayes, the big communication modem company, was in Atlanta. IBM's PC operations were in Boca Raton, Florida. CompuServe, a major online service, was in Columbus, Ohio. Sprint, big communications company, was in Kansas City. Dell, of course, was in Austin. Microsoft actually started in Seattle, in Albuquerque before moving to Seattle. So that first wave was pretty distributed. It was only the second wave when it became, kind of software and apps and so forth, that really Silicon Valley dominance became, clear. I think in the third wave, it will disperse, and Silicon Valley will continue to be a magnet for talent, still be where most of the capital is. But some people, including perhaps some on this call, maybe some were in San Francisco 3 years ago and are somewhere else now. Maybe some on this call were investing just in the Silicon Valley or broader Bay Area a few years ago, or starting to invest in other places, and I think that will only accelerate over the next decade. So I don't think there's anything to fear about a decline of Silicon Valley. I think it will force a rethink, and anytime any place, but particularly Silicon Valley, has been forced to rethink, it's led to a rebirth, rejuvenation, new ideas, new industries, and so forth. And no doubt that will happen again.
Okay, you talked briefly about immigration and immigration visas. Are there other issues or policy areas that you think in the current administration in Washington could work on to better support startup success in the U.S.?
Well, I'm actually working on this. You mentioned in the introduction, I was the co-chair of the first National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which I did, 11, 12 years ago. And when Gina Raimondo became as the Secretary of Commerce a year and a half ago, she asked for a couple things that she should focus on. I said there's several things, including focusing more on regional hubs, but also it might be a good idea to restart that advisory council. And said, okay, I'll do that, but I want you to co-chair it again. So I'm happy to do it. We actually have a meeting later this week here in DC, and there are a number of areas that we're focused on, including making sure America leads in some of the industries of the future, and also moving ahead on this regional hub piece. And there was some legislation that passed this summer that did authorize the funding for the regional hubs. We now need to make sure that gets appropriated and then gets implemented in a smart way. So I think, and even the Treasury Secretary recently, Janet Yellen, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, talked about essentially this idea of kind of leveling the playing field, creating more opportunity for more places. Some of the themes that we talk about in the Rise of the Rest book. So I think that's promising, that there's more of a focus on expanding the innovation, capital, talent, job creation, so it's more dispersed across the country. I think that is definitely a step in the right direction. Some of I mentioned before, some of the other legislation, including around climate, I think is also helpful. That could be a catalyst for a number of different different sectors.
Okay. How about that same question at a state or local level? Gina Raimondo was governor of Rhode Island, and before that, she was a venture capitalist, so she's got a natural understanding of some of these. But if you're talking to a mayor or a governor, what are the types of things that they should be asking themselves, or things that would be helpful to encourage a startup culture?
Well, I do spend a lot of time with mayors and governors, including recently a group of mayors. And I think I watched this, again, you've been doing this work for a while as well. I watched this develop over the last decade. And there has been, I think, a meaningful pivot in terms of rethinking economic growth and really trying to focus on more startups. Some of that is just paying attention. I talked to the governor of Virginia a couple weeks ago, and he's been an hour a day talking to different business leaders, including reaching out to promising entrepreneurs, just to encourage them and figure out ways to showcase them. More governors are doing that, more mayors are doing that, recognizing that often the big companies are able to get attention, but the small companies aren't, figuring out ways to address that. In some places, things like angel tax credits to create more investment capital, and that work. Some states have actually created venture vehicles where they are investing in funds that are going to be looking at backing some of the companies in their region. So there's a variety of things that are being done, and different experiments being run in different cities, different states. I think the most important thing, though, is this mental shift to saying, we need to really be focusing more on the entrepreneurs, more on the new companies, and less on the big CEOs of the big companies.
It was astounding to me when I was starting my role in the state of California, how much my conversations with other states and economic development people were, we're going to come to your state and convince people to move their headquarters to our state.
Exactly. No, it's sort of it's the obvious thing to start at. It leads to, if you're successful, a nice photo op. But if you track it over time, it hasn't really worked in terms of the investment. In most cases, there's certainly exceptions in most cases. And I think people are realizing it's better off kind of figuring out how to, launch those new companies, to create an environment that really, allows you to win that battle for talent, that battle for capital.
Okay, it's time for a couple more questions. So how about advice to education leaders, particularly in post-secondary, in a world in which startups and the jobs that they create are going to be an important part of the employment picture as well? What can they be doing to help encourage the mindset and capabilities that people need to be successful entrepreneurs and the ecosystems around them?
I think something we've talked about, I think, is trying to, when people are on campus, figure out ways to create that environment that's supportive of entrepreneurs. Some like I remember in Utah, one of the universities actually created a dorm focused on entrepreneurs, and to really kind of gather them together, spotlight them. So there's a bunch of different things happening in different places. But the intention at Purdue, they've really focused quite significantly on launching startups out of Purdue. So it's been super helpful. In Indiana, Mitch Daniels done a great job on that after being a Fortune 500 CEO, really kind of doubling down on trying to support that entrepreneurial community. And as you say, some of it is a mindset, and some encouraging more creativity, risk-taking, experimentation, educating people, particularly in this next wave we're into, where course, the technology is important, but there are other aspects that are important. Partnerships are critically important to really revolutionize healthcare. Many of these other sectors is not what any one technology enables or any one company does. It's more of a systems level kind of integration and transformation that's required. So people have that understanding around forming partnerships, I think is helpful. Even understanding some of the nuances of policy are becoming more important, because most of these sectors that are up for grabs in the next decade do tend to be more regulated, things like healthcare and fintech and so forth. So I think there's some sensitivity on that, and some training on that would be helpful. And then once people graduate, as I said earlier, trying to figure out some way to at least make it possible for the ones who want to stay where they are, as opposed to feel like they have to move away, and some way to stay connected to your alumnus in general, but with a particular focus on entrepreneurship. A number of universities have done different weekends where they try to get people back. And when the people are coming back, usually it's for a big football game weekend or something like that, they build a lot of programming around it, including educating people about what's happening in that local community with entrepreneurs. So could lead to mentoring, could lead to investment, could lead to customers, other kinds of things. So just leverage that that asset you have, and the people that have been dispersed, and figure out a way to have them be supportive of the entrepreneurs that are that are emerging kind of from those universities.
Great. Well, we're down to the time for last two questions. So Steve, I've been working with you in different ways on these issues for more than a decade now, and you're clearly passionate about this, and we've had a good discussion about many reasons why. But I just want to ask you more personally. You could be doing a lot of things at this stage in your life than getting on a bus every year and touring a bunch of cities around the country. Why are you so excited about it? What drives you to do this at this stage?
I think I have to. I think it's something I wasn't looking to do, but the more I learned about it, the more I felt it was important to do, and it's something I think I can contribute to, and shining a spotlight on it, changing some policies, shifting some of the the flows of capital, and I just feel like it's important to support this next generation of entrepreneurs. It's important to do it in a more inclusive way. It's important to make sure that we're doing everything we can to create more opportunity for more people in more places. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., which, as you know, has gotten hyper-partisan, gridlocked, kind of not much people can agree on. We usually can get agreement on issues around innovation, entrepreneurship. And part of the reason it's hyper-partisan is because, as you know, our politics have become very challenging, and there are many aspects for it. I don't want to overly simplify it, but one aspect, I think an important aspect, is an opportunity gap that exists in this country. And the folks listening who are in the Bay Area, a lot of great things are happening there, and many of you are leading the charge. And congratulations and thanks. But there are a lot of people in different parts of the country that have been left out, that have been left behind, that they're seeing disruption as job destruction in their families and their community. And we need to offset that, at least in part, by backing new companies that can create new jobs, and not just coding jobs. I was in Detroit yesterday, and a couple companies we backed there that are doing really well. One's called Shinola, that basically was it's not focused on watches and other goods, but was retraining auto workers to, instead of building cars, to build watches. And that company's scaled up, and now I think has well over 1,000 employees. Another company called StockX, which is sort of a stock exchange for things, started just 5-6 years ago. We were the initial seed investor. They now have 1,500 employees, and some are focused on technology. Many are focused on kind of managing the warehouse, authentication. It's kind of an e-commerce business, initially focused on sneakers. When they send the sneakers in, that and have to be authenticated. So that actually are jobs for people that aren't necessarily coded. We have to launch more of these companies in more parts of the country. We have to create more jobs, not just the technology jobs, but a broad range of jobs. Otherwise, this divide we have in the country is only going to grow worse, and that will, I think, disadvantage us in what is now global competition for the future.
Great. Okay, last question for you, Steve, from our audience. What was the best piece of professional advice you've ever received, and if you will, who was it from?
Well, I got a lot of it. It'd be hard to pick one. There is one of our venture capitalists Frank Coffield, actually, Kleiner Perkins Coffield Byers, and one of the iconic Silicon Valley firms. He was on our board for many years. And I remember I was pretty young at the time. I was initially when I was co-founder, I was the EVP, and then a few years later I became the CEO, and I was like 30-ish or what have you. And he really stressed the importance of people, which seems obvious, but most people don't focus on it. They say it, but they don't focus on it enough. And also on making sure that you are kind of focused on the next chapter of your business. You're not just managing what exists, but imagining what you're going to be in a year or two, and kind of planning in advance of that. So you kind of know where the puck is going. I thought that was important advice. And I also got advice from our co-founder, Jim Kimsey, who was a couple decades older than me. And we had some difficult days where we almost didn't make it. And he kept reminding me and our team that I think it's a Nietzsche quote: "It doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger." That sometimes, what looks like a problem, maybe even a crisis, maybe an existential threat, actually can it sometimes turn into an opportunity. And you just have to keep, moving forward and kind of, don't give up. So often people give up just at the wrong time. If they just kept fighting a little longer, it might have been the breakthrough that they've long been hoping for.
Well, thank you. We're unfortunately at the end of our time, but as always, it's great to spend some time with you, Steve. And a big round of virtual applause and thank you for Steve Case, author of The Rise of the Rest, for joining us today. We encourage everyone to go to your local bookstore and pick up a copy if you haven't already, or they're available online on the Commonwealth Club's website. And if you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. Again, thank you, Steve, for spending some time with us today. Good luck on the book. And thank you for helping encourage the rise of the rest. I'm Lenny Mendonca.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, and see you next time.